Getting a custom tune on your rear shock might not be the first thing you think of when you're looking at upgrading your mountain bike, but I want to talk about why getting mine custom tuned was the best $100 I've spent on my bike, and I've spent enough Benjamins on this thing. This is my Salsa Blackthorn, which shares a frame with Salsa's longer travel Cassidy. As you can see by the name on the bike, I bought it as a Cassidy and then bought the extra linkage and suspension components to be able to convert it to the shorter travel Blackthorn, which is a configuration I ride in most of the time. I had a great experience with the DVO Topaz that came on the Ibis Ritmo AF that this bike was replacing, and decided to stick with what I liked when choosing suspension components for the Blackthorn. Salsa does provide some insights into which shocks they recommend that they know will mesh well with the frame's kinematics, or in other words, how the rear linkage applies force to a shock. But I wanted to stick with my preferred DVO option, which wasn't officially on their list, and I wanted to try it out in its stock configuration. I spent a few months riding the stock DVO shock with this bike, and I got a feeling pretty close to good, but I kind of felt like I was always compromising between small bump compliance or support for bigger hits or cornering. And I also wanted to be able to slow the rebound down a little bit more than the stock setup would allow, and felt like sometimes I was getting bucked when coming off of jumps. Now, there's plenty of tuning that you can do at home, both on the DVO Topaz and any rear shock you might have, even if you're not very mechanically inclined. There's the basic air pressure, or spring rate, which you adjust with a shock pump. There's the rebound knob that most shocks will feature. And on the DVO, you can adjust the bladder pressure, which controls how oil flows, and it, according to DVO, changes the firmness of the shock throughout the stroke. The Topaz can also take both positive and negative air volume spacers, which do dramatically change how the shock feels. And it has a 3-position compression switch for pedaling or climbing support. Many other high-end shocks and the next generation DVO include compression damping knobs as well. Despite all the great adjustability and tunability that comes on the shock, at the end of the day, when they leave the factory, they're aimed at fitting a range of riders and bikes and terrain, and I think that my combination of me, this bike, and this terrain just didn't quite fit inside that box. DVO offers this handy form that you can submit to sum up your tuning and rider preferences, but you can also reach out over the phone or email and chat with them in greater detail. So as you can see here, I described the challenges I was having and how I wanted the shock to feel, and of course filled in details about myself, my bike, where I ride, and how I like to ride. So what does DVO do that's different than all the tuning that you can do at home? In short, shim stacks. There's one for your compression, or what the shock does when it's being smushed, and one for your rebound, or what the shock does when it's trying to extend back out. And the shim stacks control how oil flows throughout the shock, which can effectively change how the shock deals with the different forces being applied by the bike and what you're riding. So what I had described to DVO in my initial request was that I wanted to maintain the small bump compliance that I really appreciated about the shock, but increase the support that I was getting in the middle and at the end of the stroke so that I didn't have to rely so heavily on volume spacers, which give a little bit of a harsher ramp up and just a feel that I didn't love. And I also wanted to be able to slow down the rebound. And so the compression and rebound shim stacks were adjusted accordingly. So how did it work out in the end? Well, like I said at the beginning of the video, getting the shock custom tuned was the best $100 I've spent on this bike, and it addressed all the shortcomings that I talked about earlier. Here's some fun footage from a slightly awkward angle that shows this new custom tuned shock at work. For chunky descending and taking repeated hits, it's active and keeps the bike feeling glued to the ground, but doesn't get overwhelmed and stuck down in the travel. For bigger hits, such as drops or rollers with harsh transitions, it feels much more supportive throughout the stroke on the landing and pretty close to bottomless, without feeling like it blows right through the middle of the travel or having any sort of harsh ramp up towards the end. when preloading to punch up something or hit a jump, it takes your input and then gives a nice pleasant spring on the way back up. When pedaling and climbing over bumpy and technical terrain, it stays very active but doesn't suck away all my pedaling energy. And when pedaling on smooth terrain, there's a little bit of pedal bob, but I still really never reach down for that climb switch. It might not be necessary for you, but every combination of bike and rear shock and terrain, whether you're buying a new bike or building one up from the ground or just looking to upgrade, is made for a default range of riders, and you might simply not fit. And so I would encourage you, of course, to first double check that your shock is correctly set up and experiment. But if you're feeling like you just can't quite get it to behave the way you want, check out a custom tune. It might be worth it. Thanks for watching.